Thank you to everyone for joining us for this talk on picturing new identities and uncovering archives. My name is Izabella Scott, and I am a writer and editor based in London. And I'm really excited to be introducing these wonderful participants that we have with us. And hopefully our conversation will be centering on, or at least beginning with, 4 books by these wonderful participants, which have come out with MAC and self-published Be Happy in the past year. So we have Keisha Scarville, her book Lick of the Tongue, Rub of a Finger on Soft Wound, which was out last October. Justine Kurland, This Train, published in February. Carmen Winant, The Last Safe Abortion, which was out in April, and a book edited by Charlotte Flint on T. Corinne's work called A Forest Fire Between Us. So some wonderful books. And I hope some of the themes of our conversation will be around representation, identity, and the role of photography can play, something around building kin, which is a big theme in everyone's work, and also the archive. So without any more introduction, I'll get going, and I hope I could start with you, Justine, asking you about the book we just mentioned, This Train, which is a very compelling book, and it's built up with these 2 quite different strands, both kind of archival in a sense, in that they were kind of made between 2005 and 2010. And perhaps you could speak a little bit about the book and the relationship between these parts. What was it like to return to these images and how the parts fit together?
Well, thank you so much, Isabel. I want to say firstly that this is like the most amazing group of people to be part of, because I couldn't feel more connected to like each and every one of you. And I just wanted to like take a minute to kind of because I think it's kind of important before I talk about my work that like, you know, Charlotte representing T. Corinne here, you know, forms for me a really important foremother of queer photography that I don't exist without. I feel like I feel so connected to Carmen's bringing in 70s alternative communities, which was really the basis of my childhood. And I think for both of us, there's this project that there can be an alternative, you know, that I think we're all here engaged on. And Keisha, whose work with both collage and photography, I mean, it blows my mind the way that she is able to make in her photographs grids of moving coordinates that kind of break open indexical ideas of what we think we know, so that we can create these through lines of continuity that connect like both a kind of pastness and a future to this ongoingness, which I feel like is the kind of most important thing that photography can do right now with the archive. And I was holding up your book, Izabella, where I'm like, this book is such an important example, I think, of what it is to comb through an archive in the aftermath of crisis and piece together some truth out of the skewed distortions of these grand narratives that we're told, that's just continually being fed to us as we're, you know, through the Israel-Gaza war, through our Trump elections, you know, and I think that really speaks to why it is so important to like make holes in these narratives so that we can actually breathe and so that, you know, so many people that are erased and pushed underwater can live. So that's like the most, like, that's why I'm like, woo, this group of people, yes, thank you. But to just, I mean, and I don't know how long I should be talking, but just to say about This Train, it is a revisiting of work that I made 15 years ago. And I have a lot of things to say about that work, but just in context of what we're doing here today, I think that the most important thing for me about that work was the idea that 15 years ago when I showed that work, and when it was like, we weren't having these conversations, and when the canon of photography was so oppressively the only conversation in the room, that when I showed this work the first time around, I it assimilated to an idea of the road trip vis-a-vis Joel Sternfeld, Stephen Shore, this idea of this kind of American westward photography that is really, in my mind, part of the problem of a kind of colonialist settler land grab. Like, we go out west and we bring the news home, this extraction, any number of things. But in fact, my relationship to the road was because I grew up on Renaissance fairs, and my mother piled me and my siblings in a van because she was a single mom and made clothing and sold them on fairs. And so my attachment to the road is so much part of my understanding of family. So it made sense that when I had a kid, I would just pile him in a car. I would continue to make this work on the road. But I also want to come back, and I want to just say a minute that I wouldn't be able to make this revision of the work had I not started making reprisal part of what my practice was when I did the Scum Manifesto, where you can see I'm surrounded by books. I love photo books. I took my own personal library of photo books, which I, realized was like 99% white men, which were the men that I was taught by and of, that had a monopoly on all of the publishing and exhibitions and museums and collections. And I cut up all these books and made these new, like, reauthored collages. That was a conduit for me. Like, Keisha, who's here, was at a show that I curated called The Rose, which was 41 artists. It was in the Lumber Room in Portland, Oregon. I think it's the most important thing that I ever did. Because more than any one thing that I've ever made, it's really about how we're creating collectively, how we bring photography forward, and we can only bring it forward by opening up this space. And I imagined when I was cutting up those collages, I was a little termite, like just digging into this like foundation that I was like, it was going to crumble from the top, but it was like, it's about opening up space and freeing these spaces. I'm going to wrap up really quickly because I feel like I talked way too long, but just to say the revisiting of the train work was to talk about like what trains actually are, like, embedded in those landscapes that I photographed is the kind of displacement of Indigenous people, the Anthropocene, and the tens of thousands of Chinese American laborers that were killed during, in very unsafe working conditions and then denied citizenship. But that I'm reconciling that with my boy's love of trains, and that there's this kind of contradiction inherent. And the reason why this book was an accordion book is because there's these kind of there's so many contradictions in how we're able to live and move forward and move through and sit with the kind of this in the blood of all of the violence of history and find our way forward. And maybe I'll just end with that.
Wow. Thank you so much for that. That was amazing. I loved how you brought together this sense of what this group means to you, and it was so beautiful to hear that. Thank you. And I think you articulated so well this richness to the work because there's so many threads beneath it. It's kind of deceptively simple with these two strands, and so much happens within the kind of conversation and all these histories that are revoked. And it was wonderful to hear you speak about T. Corinne, because I suppose talking about kinship and this idea of influence, and it's wonderful, Charlotte, that this book is brought together so much archival material. And I mean, it's such a luscious, beautiful book to spend time with. And there's not just T's voice, but so many other figures, these documents from the time. You get such a sense of this movement in history and the arguments being made, the debates being had, and just so many. I mean, just seeing the images of these kind of women photographing completely naked in the in the wild. It's amazing to see. But I'd love to hear you, Charlotte, to speak a little bit about that book. I mean, just what it was like to return to these very intimate archives and putting it together, your relationship with tea. It'll be wonderful to hear you evoke that.
Yeah, thank you so much. And just to echo Justine, I'm awestruck to be sharing space with you all. And thank you so much. I'm so inspired by all of your work. And thank you for those lovely words about the book. I'm so pleased to hear it. I think, well, kind of starting from the beginning, I always think about T's work finding me. I felt like it came to me at a point in my life when it needed to find me for some reason. And it came, and that introduction was through the Feminist Library in London. And I was spending some time there doing a project, and they had a wonderful artist in residence, and she was showing me some of her favourite things in the library. And one of them was this incredible photograph taken from T's book, Yantras of Woman Love. And it was one of her kaleidoscopic photo collages. And, you know, when you're shown something and you think, what is this? This is just incredible. I couldn't place it. It could have been some kind of 1930s solarized photograph. It could have been some kind of 70s punky photo collage. I just couldn't in any way place it. And it was this incredible, really sort of glowing image of these limbs and hands and bodies entwined that on one hand looks really abstract, but when you kind of dig in and look a bit closer, you sort of understand what's happening. And it's these female bodies entwined. And it's just, it was like a lightning bolt sort of moment. And it felt really, really special. And I couldn't believe I'd never heard about this incredible person before. And so it really began with one photograph in one library, and it kind of took me on this journey. And what I tried to do as best I can was let her voice kind of lead me. So I was very much reading everything that I could possibly find. There were lots of online blogs and things like that, which were really fantastic, talking about voices and friends of hers and people who were really inspired by her practice. And then I was reading a bit more about her and saw that she bequeathed her entire archive to the University of Oregon. And they had a travel fellowship every year, which I applied for. And it was through that travel fellowship that I made my first visit there. And so I kind of tried to go about it in as organic a way as possible. I wasn't really sure what the outcome would be. You know, at the time I was working as a curator, and I was thinking this would be a really incredible exhibition. But the more I kind of listened to her and kind of followed her through the archive, it felt like this would be a really special book. And you know, she talked so much about books and how important they were in terms of circulation as a tool of reaching lots of different people. They could go further than an exhibition could. And she called books portable galleries with paper walls, which I absolutely loved. And I liked the idea of this book as a bit of a tool that kind of moved in between an exhibition that you could have on your own and something that could circulate and move around. I wanted the book to feel like you were in an archive, to kind of be rifling through the material. I wanted it to feel tactile, and I wanted it to feel both intimate but also celebratory. And, you know, this kind of, so to have this large format with all these beautifully reproduced images, I mean, it just feels like it feels incredible after spending time in the archive. And kind of having to dig through boxes, and now it's kind of out in the world, and it's this moment where lots of people can enjoy her work. And I can't really put into words what her work means to me. Like, I truly think it's changed my life. And I feel like I say, I've just tried to be led by her voice as best I possibly can. And the voices of other people around her. And that's why it was so important to kind of, you know, it was wonderful that Jeb could include the letter from Jeb, and then she wrote her beautiful contemporary reflection, and to have the chronology in the back of the book as well. So I wanted to ensure that it felt as full as possible, for want of a better expression, just kind of. And I think also I remember reading that he had sort of Sorry, this is very distracting.
Okay.
She had so many difficulties when doing her own research about other women artists and she was hoping that her work would exist in archives and be there and be accessible for future generations. She sort of saw herself as she described it as part of a continuum of artists. So I'm hoping that this is a building block in helping her be better known.
Mm.
Mhm.
I mean, it really feels kind of captured in the book, this sense of this community, this wider community through the different writings that are contained, and it's a beautiful sense of the kind of breadth and the collaborative way this kind of movement was functioning. There's even these kind of, I really remember these call outs that is even to, inviting women to come to certain workshops. I think it's around the Cunt coloring book, which was outlines of women's vaginas to color them in, to kind of research, and it's these call outs. So there's a sense of this wider community being spoken to, and then this community forming. And yeah, it's wonderful to think how that work can change people's lives, at such different moments, from the 70s till now, and kind of into the future. I wanted to turn to you, Carmen, because there's a sense. I mean, I love what you just said, Charlotte, about the book being this kind of object that can travel, which is one of T's ideas. And in your book, Carmen, I mean, it's an amazing assemblage of so many images that I collected from these different archives that you visited all around abortion. And it would be wonderful to hear a little bit about the trip and about the assembling of the images and the nature of the images found in there, because it's wonderful to spend time with them. This range of kind of reenaction images that are teaching and guiding women who might be thinking about coming, to kind of other educational images. It's a really unusual textured kind of archive that you assemble together in this book.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that. I want to just echo what everybody has said already and join the Mutual Admiration Club first. Thank you, Izabella, for hosting this and your thoughtful questions. I sort of stand in awe of everybody here today. I don't have enough time to get into sort of all of the particularities there, except to say perhaps that, yes, T has also been, I mean, I think of being on like a first name basis with her, as if she's a kind of intimate. And I think that there's something in the work that holds that, like holds that kind of closeness and tenderness and invitation that has yielded all of us, as Justine said, in so many ways. I also just wanted to say that Justine, as I've told them many times, came to a graduate seminar that I was in graduate school, and was the first person that I heard speak about being a mother and an artist and being on the road and figuring out how to afford film and how to, eat at a whole meal at Whole Foods for you and your child while you're shopping, like how to survive, and I really took that so deeply to heart. It was really informing then, as it is now. Okay, to the question. Yes, I think of the book, The Last Safe Abortion, as being a political project, an ideological project in every sense. I don't think of it as being sort of as existing within the documentary genre per se, which whatever, maybe that's like an abstruse, differentiation that only I care about. But to me, it's a meaningful one because so much of the book, like the sort of the slow build up to thinking about how I wanted to make that book, if I should make it, why it should exist, was really founded, as I've talked about a bit in the past, in my experience of organizing, my sort of years in organizing in and around abortion access and reproductive justice writ large, but living in the Midwest also and working on a big college campus at Ohio State University, is every week, basically, I navigate around these enormous photographs of, of anti-abortion crusaders who are on campus, right, and have these big posters or sort of sandwich board, style photographs with these sort of, so-called fetuses, like, overblown and and printed so that they can be seen, you know, a city block away. And those, I mean, we can look at those pictures and understand them very clearly as like a kind of ideological warfare, right? Waged through visuality, like through the use of representation and specifically photographs. So it took me a long time, actually sort of embarrassing long time, as I was circumnavigating them to teach photography, like in the building behind. You know, it took me a long time to ask the question, I should say, of like, where are our pictures? You know, like, why is it that pictures are historically so absent from the sort of reproductive justice movement, which is a political movement, ideological movement, a grassroots movement? And what do we stand to lose by not having them, right? And so that's really where the process was born, where the project was born, out of this question. And it wasn't a question that at that point I felt like I had any sort of resolution toward. And it was really only, and this is now I'm finally making address of your question, it was really only in visiting clinics themselves that a kind of answer, or, you know, sort of a way to address that question began to surface. And that was, in fact, somebody in the clinic gave me this language. That was through taking pictures and drawing pictures from the inside, right? So as opposed to sort of thinking about not just these like really sort of gory sandwich board poster images, but also sort of what is our visual lexicon of abortion, or of like sort of the abortion clinic. You know, it's so fraught, it's so hostile. It's pictures of clinics being firebombed. It's pictures of cops confronting Operation Rescue protesters. You know, like there's just so few pictures that I had seen up until that point of care, of demonstrative care, which is of course such a hard thing to picture. You know, it's like, how do you make a picture of expressed tenderness, of holding space for somebody else, of making them feel safe? That is like necessarily unphotographic, right? It like, that's what gives it its power in some ways, is that it exists outside of the framework of representation. Okay, to get to your question, there's really three buckets that substantiate this project, both the book and the installation. One of them, and this is the biggest bucket, are photographs that are held in and made by the clinic workers themselves. So that's, you know, over a dozen different clinics. I started in the Midwest and I moved to the South in the United States, so in two specific regions. And, you know, there are some clinics that have boxes and boxes and boxes of these photographs. I call them an archive, but they call them like the photographs in the closet, you know, and they would pull them out and we would look through them together in many cases. The second bucket were our sort of more kind of capital A archival images, as we might understand them, that were in special collections, in historical societies, and mostly university special collections and libraries. And then the third bucket are photographs that I made inside of clinics, which I was very hesitant to do at first. It's been a long time since I've made my own pictures, and I'm also very sensitive to frankly, just how dangerous it is for people who work in clinics, and you know, how they have to pass through you know, metal detectors every day just to go to work. And, you know, this question of like not doing harm, not sort of perpetuating harm through my work. So those were the three sort of substantial, I suppose we could call them all archives, that I drew from in the making of this work, which again, sort of I thought of as having a political end and operating as a political tool, to demonstrate just how normal and unsensational and ungraphic this work is on the inside. I mean, if anybody has ever been to an abortion clinic, like forget abortion clinic, if you've been to like a healthcare, you know, context, particularly a feminist healthcare context, it's just like so regular. You know, they're drawing blood and they're doing pap smears and they're sterilizing medical equipment and they're, you know, washing the gowns and they're having birthday parties for each other. It's just like, it's so relentlessly regular, you know? And so demonstrating that, however banal, or rather because it was banal and mundane, as care work so often is, you know, it felt really important to, to center that and to make these largely women, you know, the protagonists of the story. And then the last thing I want to say is that And something Justine said reminded me of this, you know, in terms of how everybody here, how there's sort of this undercurrent of whatever we want to call it, like world building or just a sort of understanding and appreciation that another world is possible, which for me is really the feminist imperative. You know, I think of imagination really as like being the tool that artists and activists share in this regard, right? Like both, that's the engine, you know, of building new prospects and possibilities that we haven't yet seen. And I say that to my own students all the time, and I try to hold it close. So I just thought I would like push that out into the discussion. I can end for now, but I have other questions for people should we have the time in the end.
Wow, thank you so much for distilling your ideas with such clarity. It was really exciting to hear you kind of talk through how you came upon that sort of methodology, I suppose, and perspective, and that idea of like, yeah, this question of how to represent care. Is it representable? How to get inside the spectacle of, you know, anti-abortion propaganda. What does this antidote look like? It's like it's a huge and exciting question that I think the book really kind of offers some really tangible visual sort of answers or beginnings of answers to that question. I was thinking as you spoke that kind of care work is a wonderful way to think about all the work that all of you are making. And I want to kind of turn to you, Keisha, next, and I'm sorry to have made you wait till the end. But I was thinking, you know, as Carmen was speaking about care work and about ideas of new registers and this beautiful point about the imagination, and thinking about, I mean, there's something incredibly powerful encountering your book. There's something kind of thrumming within it in the way that you bring together these quite different images and the constellation. You create this ecosystem that functions, that feels like it speaks to this idea about a new register and what we can create. Where can we push photography and sequence and the book form and the mood? And I mean, I'm searching for words for it because it's a feeling that you have as you spend time with that book. So I'd just like to ask you to kind of speak to the book, to the ecosystem you built, these images in relation. There's archival images, there's staged images, there's a range of things brought together, assemblages and gestures. And it's a very startling thing to encounter.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I also want to thank everyone for being here. I'm kind of sitting here in a space of like profound joy of just being able to have this conversation, and just what I'm also thinking about like the way in which the work that I think that you're all doing, and I'm thinking about not only how this occupies this kind of like the constellation on my screen, but just like this constellation of thought, and how we, but most specifically you, are thinking about like the thought, like the word, the image that is required for us to get into the basis of our existence. And so I just want to say thank you. And I'm just happy to be here. So the book, like there was so much about the book that didn't exist before the book. So the book was kind of this like active object of making. So when I came to or met with Michael to talk about it, you know, I told him there are things that I'm thinking about in the work, or the photographs that I'm making, and so much of the images that I make is about, what lies within the breaks of, my existence here and my parents' journey to immigrate to the United States. And so it didn't necessarily feel correct to just make a book that was about the images, but to think about the way in which the book can kind of open up a space to talk about like what are the images that inform the images that we make. And and so for me, I started to kind of really sit and think about, you know, what is happening on the fringes, or what's occupying my mind as I'm photographing. And so bringing in the archive, you know, and bringing in the archive not as a way to kind of uncover, but to think about the archive as this place of activation and this place of like removing its latency and, you know, kind of bringing in this understanding of its polyvocalities, but also for me, more specifically, was really about kind of the aliveness of bodies, and particularly Black bodies, my family's bodies. Um, and in thinking about aliveness as, you know, how do we make space for ourselves? And so with that, you know, bringing in all of these different images, and, you know, what I find to be true for myself and thinking about the archive, is that it's the place to inhabit and engage. And so I wanted to create a book that kind of spoke to not only the making of images, but just like this kind of temporal space that opens up when archive is kind of placed up against or within contemporary images. And I am a child of the hip hop era. And so I've always been interested in hip hop and its potential for the remix, and like what the remix offers, and like the way in which it takes something from the past and kind of repeats it in a way that offers up a new way of thinking and a new way of looking. So there's this thing about, you know, the way I'm thinking about images, and by way of the way it's overlaid or layered, that helps me to kind of engage this kind of multiplicity and kind of amplifies like these like inherent gestures and visuals of the original. So those are some things that for me, I wanted to kind of bring to the book and kind of open up this new way of like thinking where nothing is dead, you know, everything is alive and present and is pushing towards a new understanding of the future.
Wow, thank you so much for that.
No problem.
It's like, yeah, it's wonderful to hear you speak about the remix in that way and the influence of hip hop, because there is a kind of musicality to the book and the way it's sequenced, and it has a kind of beat, and this idea of what gets opened up temporally and within the pages of the book. It's really, it's wonderful to hear you speak about that. Thank you. I was thinking about a few things that have been said that I wanted to kind of maybe try and draw together a little bit. It was something you said, Carmen, where you talked about your book not as a documentary book, but as a political project. And you were saying, you know, whether that distinction is just something for you or something that's sort of larger, but it feels quite significant. And you were also talking, Keisha, about the aliveness of the archive as something, it's something that's temporally disrupted, something you bring into the present. So I'm kind of thinking about these books as political projects, as much as they're dealing with an archive and they're dealing with what we might call history or something in the past. There's a kind of activation happening in the present. There's something very political in the kind of composition of the present. And I suppose maybe I had a question to direct to you, Justine, unless anyone can is prompted by what I've been saying, but just to think about the kind of political project of your book, Justine, and what it kind of upends. You know, there's this wonderful essay at the end by Constance Debray. Oh, and there's two actually. I think it's at the beginning, this book, but it's about how it's not a family album and it's not a road album, and this idea that it's kind of upending these two genres. But it feels like, to me, the book feels also like a political project, which perhaps isn't speaking as directly to something like a political issue like abortion, but it is speaking to care and parenting and motherhood, and also this history of America, the myths, the colonialism. There's so much happening. So I just wanted to kind of ask you about that political project and how you view the book in that way.
Yeah, no, thank you. I also want to bring in Lily Chow too, who wrote the Trainside essay, because I think there's a really interesting pairing between Constance Debris, who's you know, such a kind of queer icon writer for me, is so like you know, punk rock in her way of non-apologetic, and you know, and really breaks open certain ideas of motherhood in her book Love Me Tender. But Lily Chow's is someone who has spent an enormous amount of time writing about the unmaking of Chinese American citizenship. I guess the thing that I'm talking about with my book, in the way that it touches on the political, where, you know, is I really believe in threading, and maybe this isn't just an archival thing, but the way that photography is an idiom for me of association, and that it triggers you know, this whole language and syntax and understanding, translation of things, and it's kind of about whose voices get to be in the room with us. So one of the things, I mean, that I think that I'm trying to do within that book, and why the writing in that book is so very, very, very important, is the ways that the writing as a context. I mean, it's kind of like you can take a photograph, like, you know, when I was growing up, like when people went missing, you'd put their photograph on a carton of milk. I don't think that happens anymore, but it's like, you know, this happy child picture of like a smiling school picture turns into this kind of horrible tragedy because it's on this carton of milk. So there's this kind of really interesting way that, and I think this ties into what Keisha's talking about the archive being a place of activation, is that photographs in and of themselves don't have meaning. It's how you know, and I think Alan Sekula said this, that it was the violence of the archive was not the camera, but the filing cabinet. It's about how we're kind of associating them and layering them together, you know. So it's really important for me in the ways that I'm making work, that like, it's not necessarily that the work is pointing to the politics in and of themselves, although of course I can point to them, but that it's bringing these conversations into the room, and that through association, there's this kind of space of contemplation or thinking, or ways that we can imagine differently. I guess that's what I would say. But yeah, I was writing down, well, I'll just leave it at that, because maybe someone else, that I was having like I was thinking about this kind of really interesting, maybe this is good to talk about, like Charlotte, you were talking about, I loved when you said following her voice through the archive, and I was thinking about this thing also of in Keisha's work, that I think is so much about a kind of channeling of these latencies, and I was thinking that there was something nice to tying those two together.
Yeah, I
That's
mean,
what I hope my work does too. Like, yeah.
oh, I completely agree. And I think it's just, again, thinking of the archive as a lively place, I think is really invigorating. And yeah, and I quote a photographer, Ajamu X, who's an amazing artist, who says that the archive isn't a place for things to go and die, but a place for things to go and live. And I like to think of it as being this space that kind of, you know, it can be quite sort of imposing and maybe feeling quite exclusionary, you know, particularly places that are part of universities where you've got to pre-order materials in advance, and it might not necessarily be the most welcoming environment for all people. And for me, kind of being in the archive in Oregon, it was kind of like the realities of archiving. You know, I love that quote: "The violence of the archive is not the camera, but the filing cabinet." And you know, when you're looking through, I was looking through these boxes and boxes and reams of materials from this incredible person, And but you've got, you've got your latex gloves on, and then you've got your boxes, and you can't have a pen, you have to have a pencil, you can't have a bottle of water. And it was just this, I was having this kind of really embodied experience of rifling through these materials and being quite emotional and being very teary, and then think, oh, but you can't really cry because I've got latex gloves on. And, it was something that I really wanted to, well, I hope the book does, is to kind of like convey the sort of physicality and the emotion that's imbued in all of these archives, whether they are university archives, the everyday kind of repositories of all of our memories. And these are such incredibly special places. And I think to kind of translate that to a book is, well, something I think we're all talking about in our work. I love, Carmen, when you described one of the first kind of sources for your book as being the archive. You call it the archive, but they call it the box of photographs in the closet. And, it takes on this kind of, it's this sort of quite slippery, shape-shifting kind of role within all of our work, I think.
It's making like, there's this kind of lie of this, like the archive being this thing that is sterile, or that we have to kind of protect it from our own bodily experience of it, which I think is really fascinating, in that I like you can't leave the archive without being imprinted on it and being imprinted upon, so there's something to that, of these ways in which like the archive is meant to have this kind of space of protection and being sterile, when that just isn't the case.
And I would also add that, for me, at least with this project, I can't remember exactly, Izabella, how you framed this question, but I started thinking about, for me, like the political work of the archive taking place in a lot of ways, like in terms of the web of social relations that happen around it. This is in some ways unique to this project for me, or the first time that it happened. But like, because I am working in clinics where the people themselves who are showing me the boxes are the ones who are in the photographs, or were behind the camera, and or both. And there have been months or years of conversation up to that point of like getting to know one another and establishing a sense of, mutual trust and reciprocity. Like, it, in some sense, at the end of the day, the archive in that context is a means to getting to know that person, and like building a relationship with that person, and sort of like understanding our sort of like our roles relative to each other as being, feminists several generations apart, or being in the struggle in different ways relative to that. And I haven't quite had that experience before this, where it's not that the archive is secondary, but when Keisha was talking about it not being sterile, like there was something about it that was like, it was more human than ever. There's no right or wrong way to do this, but because I haven't necessarily worked this way before, where I'm contending with archives of not just people who are alive, but like in the room with me. It just yielded like a different sort of set of relationships, and it was inherently based in like a shared politic. So it's like a little, yeah, I won't say more than that, although it's something that I could talk about for days.
When I was 18 years old and I was a student of photography, I had an abortion. And there's this time when you have the abortion where they let you sit in the room with like in the paper gown forever and ever and ever. And I took a photograph of like my own like feet in the stirrups from that point of view, as a like way to like kind of navigate the fear of that waiting space. And when I saw your book, I was like, shit, I wish I'd given Carmen this picture to,
You still have the
like,
picture?
I have it. Yeah, maybe I like, yes, I have it. It's not like then when I printed it, I was like, fuck those guys, I'm going to blow it up really big. So I think I have like a 16 by 20 of it. It's not like a,
Oh my God, I would love to see that,
but
Justine.
I would love to make a 4x6 and have it inserted into that archive, because it is this, what's so amazing about the last safe abortion is actually that I think everyone has these pictures like this. I'm sure I get calls all the time of like people wanting to donate their images to you because it's like this way that it's actually a building of an archive that doesn't exist in this kind of one spot. But
Yeah, totally. And I don't want
which also, yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say, first of all, I would love to see that photograph. And it's true that I hear from folks more and more,
Yeah.
people who are in the work, the majority of people who are in the work, but also people who are patients. And of course, those are not exclusive categories. But I wanted to add too that as a part of this project, sort of towards the end of it, after it had already gone up at the Whitney, the installation version, I got connected to this group called Maya Network, which is My Abortion Network. And one of the things that they do, they're clinicians, family practice doctors, actually, who practice abortion, patients and activists. And one of the things that they do and have been doing for years is building their own video archive of consenting patients who, want to, are willing to have their abortions filmed. And what they've started doing recently is having the patients film it from their own point of view. And it's so moving. It's like, just that, I mean, I suppose we know this as artists, whatever, it's relatively obvious, but like that subtle shift in perspective through, like through the legs, like you can't see the stirrups, but sort of almost, and you can hear the voices supporting each other and sort of narrating what's happening. It's quite moving. And they've just been sort of taking this project on independently. I don't know where it will land, but it seemed worth mentioning. What you said about making your own photograph reminded me of it. We need more pictures like that.
I just keep thinking about that idea of like the teardrop landing on the archive and that being part of then the archive, this kind of the way that it grows out. Which makes me also think about, Keisha, your the way that you used your mother's clothes in your photographs, which do you guys know about that?
Thank you, Justine. I mean, I guess I'm trying to think what the question is, but I'm gonna just talk.
No, I just wanted you to talk about that because I think it's such a, there's so many things you could talk about in Keisha's work, but I just feel like that the holding of like that happens in those photographs is maybe something that we're talking about also, and that maybe if you don't want to, you don't have to. I just was like,
we're here to talk. So I mean, my mom passed in 2015 after a year-long battle with colon cancer. And in the wake of her passing, I think a lot of things upended for me, and I mean, everything upended, but also kind of thinking about, it shifted my thinking about photography, and thinking about photography, like I went from this place of thinking about photography as this thing that, this vehicle that allows for you to kind of engage what's in front of you. And so for me, I think it came to a place where I was engaging absence, like kind of like engaging the absent body. And so how do you do that via photography? And so a lot of the work that I make, and starting in 2015, I was kind of actively using and incorporating like her clothes and her material as a way to kind of like allow for her presence to still be in the image. But it also, it also started to make me think about the the archive not necessarily always being something that is photographic. And so the archive or something that is kind of like the document, but thinking about fabric as these kind of residual transcripts. And so that was something that started to kind of be incorporated into my work, and it shows up a lot in the book. And it was just kind of a way it's always going to be a way for me to kind of hold on to my mom's presence. But also thinking about the archive, like how does the archive hold time? and even thinking about not, sometimes it's hard for me to use the word archive, and I don't know if it's maybe like a little bit of archive fatigue on my on my end, but just kind of thinking about like what are the other ways and what are the other words that allow for us to understand registers of time, and how all of that is kind of held within us. So those are some things that I think about in relationship to that work and the book.
It's funny the way that word archive can be such a kind of siphoning off as this kind of dusty, exhausting, faraway space. And it's wonderful to hear you talk a little bit more about those different registers of what the archive can be in terms of, I love that description of the way fabric can be a kind of manuscript. Sort of amazing. The way that opens up your mind to what else can be a palimpsest and be imprinted. I'm sorry,
I do want to say, like, I was reading a book. There is a book titled Archive of Conjure, and there's a chapter titled Residual Transcripts, and I remember being really fascinated, and I'm blanking on the author at the moment, but there was a chapter titled Residual transcripts, and I immediately kind of locked on to this idea of like the residual, like even kind of like the surrogate archive, and thinking about that in relationship to the presence of fabric and texture within my work. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No. It was a great answer. I was just thinking a little bit in relation to T's archive and this word archive and this idea of boxes. But I suppose in the book I was really moved by all these parts. Maybe it was in the timeline or the text, but thinking about all this work T did, like the hotlines and phone lines that she would work on to kind of build this community and speak to women. So I just wanted to ask you, Charlotte, just a little bit about the kind of wider texture of an archive, not just the prints and the documents, but because there's such a range of voices you could even speak to, the kind of amount of people and voices that come into the book and show this continuum rather than this kind of thing in the past.
I've definitely felt like that when kind of doing the research. I think it was really important for me that it had a kind of a chronology at the end, that also it contextualized her life with what was going on in the world around her. So again, something that I felt like you could refer back to between the pages if you sort of see what I mean, because the pictures don't have any captions, mainly because a lot of the prints I find didn't have captions. I wouldn't know how to caption them. So I feel like the way that the book is structured, with having the chronology at the back and then the images in the front, you can kind of move between this space of like almost like no time, and then kind of citing it within what was happening in her life. One of the most sort of, thinking about voices and community, one of the most moving things about the whole experience for me was that it seemed like she kept every letter she ever received. And there must have been 30, 40 boxes just of letters that she'd received. And that was something that I found, it was incredible, really. It was quite a strange experience. It was on one hand incredibly moving, and then on one hand I almost felt a little bit like I was kind of intruding on this really personal kind of reflective moment between the two of them. And the thing that kind of kept cropping up in these letters were that people were writing to her and saying, when I saw your photographs or when I read your writing, it's the first time I've seen myself reflected. And I think that was something that the entire project is just this kind of, this like hymn of thanks to someone who used their artistic skill to help people see themselves in a world where they weren't welcome. The images of lesbians were kind of made for men by men, of very kind of white skinny women with no hair, and it was just a bit, like I remember T had written, where are these pictures of us? that was something that a lot of people had been writing in these letters, which was so incredible, you know, and particularly when the people who wrote the letters were people who she'd photographed. And they were saying, this is the first time I've ever seen myself.
As you were talking, I was thinking about the relationship between like representation and visibility, and how that they're not the same thing. And I think there was an idea, I'm going to just generalize and say, in the last 20 years, that kind of visibility, there was a direct line from visibility to kind of rights. There was a kind of triumphant pathway, which hasn't proved to be true. But representation is something different. It can take many forms. Even the solarized pictures, they're kind of encrypted in some way. Thinking about your work, Keisha, there's so much representation, but there's a different register. And I suppose I was just kind of would love to hear more from you, Carmen, just about the, you know, you said earlier that the archive or the images are important, but it's more about the structure you build. And of course, finding this different register for care. But there is a sense, and you write so well in the essay at the end of the book about, it's a book about care workers. And it's like, what does a structure look like that actually, like, what is different about this kind of pro-choice movement in that it thinks about the whole network of relations that exist, not just this kind of fetus or this kind of, you know, and I suppose thinking about the care workers, are they being paid well? What's their, you know, what's their life? Do they have access to abortion? You know, this idea that it's a much richer fabric of relations, that's kind of, yeah, this kind of relationship visibility and the structure of the book that you were actually capturing in that work.
Thanks. I hope I was capturing it. As I spoke to early, like demonstratively, it is hard to capture. And that's part of the reason that like there's such a great volume of photographs, you know, is like just to point to it iteratively, right? It's not all going to be in one kind of image. It's a strategy that I really started to learn or think about in the project that predated this one, which was called A Brand New End and Centered Domestic Violence Advocacy and Support Workers. And it was the first time that I, in a really dedicated way, like got out of the studio, you know, and I've spoken a little bit about this, and I wrote about it in the essay, sort of how many years I spent alone, you know, and lonely, frankly, in the studio by myself, you know, appropriating images, for lack of a better word, you know, like cutting things out. And it was a very isolating experience. And ironically, you know, the work was about coalition building and like how we make feminist grassroots, sometimes underground networks, you know, that are so much about like pushing outward. And like the material that I'm cutting up so often is like, has a kind of manual element to it. You know, they're like teaching and learning pamphlets or books, right? It's like all kind of feminist lit. I have a book from 1964 in my studio, about how to self-administer, you know, like a vacuum aspiration abortion at home, you know, and it has photographs in it. It's like, there's something so fundamentally like forward facing about that, however, underground. And so there sort of became like a mounting disconnect in my work, emotional disconnect, you know, like to use Keisha's word from earlier, like I felt like off register. And so in making and sort of turning towards the workers themselves with A Brand New End, you know, women who have been in this work for like, I mean, dozens of years. They are warriors, you know, and yeah, figuring out like how to align myself with them, how not to sort of overstep or make their situations feel harmful or precarious. I mean, that's just challenging. I made all sorts of fuck ups, you know, especially initially. And I remember when I started working on The Last Safe Abortion, photographing in the clinics, I was already sort of insecure about picking up the camera, and then photographing in those contexts, as I mentioned, felt sort of particularly shaky. And I kept apologizing, and I was like so nervous not to step on anybody's toes, sort of literally or figuratively. And finally, one of the staffers in a clinic in Iowa City said to me, like, just stop apologizing. You know, she was like very direct and effectively said, like, you know, we get it. Like, we're hip to what you're doing. oftentimes the clinics would refer to it as storytelling as opposed to art making, which I think is a really interesting distinction. You know, and she gave me the gift in that moment of saying, like, we understand the way in which this is mutually serviceable, and we understand you to also be in the work, albeit in a different way. And that was such like the ultimate gift to me, you know, in terms of what it meant to be in that situation. And to feel in that. And sometimes, if anything, I was like a detriment, you know, like I was getting in their way, or they needed to get to their clinic hours, or they had to rearrange what was on their desk so they couldn't have anything, you know, patient related junk. So it was just like, it was a hassle, right? In addition to sort of putting them potentially in harm's way. So that helped me kind of get over, sorry, Izabella, I feel like I've lost your initial question, but that helped me kind of get over that initial hump, you know, around like, how do you do this? Like, how do you activate this thing while taking pictures in this space, while also, yeah, gaining the sort of the trust and demonstrating a kind of, as I said earlier, kind of reciprocity with folks in the process.
Because it really feels that's kind of captured in the book. And I would say about all your work, something about process being present in a way that's deeply enriching, which is kind of really exciting. And we've been talking about kind of networks of relation and all the ways an image is made. Keisha, you talked about the image that informs the image, and this idea of what's backstage or what's behind, and the many collaborators. At the end of your book, Justine, you kind of, there's this note that somehow really stuck out to me, where you kind of talk to her about your son as this, and his resilience, and as a kind of, almost as a collaborator, this person that is kind of, and you feel that in the books, of the perspective, this kind of rich tapestry of people who are making the work, which I think is part of a feminist practice, to kind of make plain, make clear, to kind of show that.
Could I say one more thing? Sorry, I know you're building towards a question, I think.
No.
I just wanted to add one thing that I would be an oversight if I didn't say, remembering your initial question, which is that it's so important that these contexts are not just health contexts, but feminist healthcare contexts. Like, I write about this a little bit in the book, but they're so clear about that, and like what that means, you know. And they say, like, I've never worked anywhere else like this. That's non-punitive, you know, that's humane, that provides like loans, you know, without interest to its own staff, that like understands that mothers are in prison and children are sick, you know. And so like there's just an on and on. There's such a feminist consciousness that permeates through these places. So it's not just that they're providing care that we can sort of understand to be feminist oriented, but like how they function fundamentally, you know, is in itself, yeah, quite feminist. So I just want to, I remember the seed of your question. So I just wanted to circle back to that and carry on.
Yeah, I mean, it's so sad to say, but we've come up to an hour, so there's so much more to talk about, and it
Wait, can I say something before we go? Because it actually ties into what you said about how part of the ways that we're working is to give visibility to all of the collaborators involved. So I just was wondering if you want to end with like a little mention of your book.
Okay.
I just think it would be nice to.
I mean, it's the books came out of a spirit of collaboration. It's co-written, and it's working with 3 Kashmiri photographers. So there's this kind of sense. The photographers are part of a collective. It's one of it's the kind of first female-led photography collective in Kashmir. So it's these 3 friends, and they have our collective. And my co-writer and I are also a collective. So there was this sense of that in the book, and we also work with a lot of different advocacy organizations and journalists working under extreme conditions. And the book has these kind of, the end of a lot of the sentences, we have these kind of square brackets that say the name of the newspaper or the report. And I think it can on first appearance, it can, I mean, maybe it appears clunky, but you kind of learn to read it. But it was this idea to visualize, to show the many, many authors of this work, of this book. So thank you for kind of pointing to that. I feel my brain is, I'm so alive from this conversation. We're talking about the archive being alive, but it's been so exciting to hear all of you speak. I feel
Can I ask Justine a question before we go?
Yeah.
It's only loosely related. Sorry, I know you keep trying to wrap up. You started out, Justine, by talking, of course, we can see all the books behind you and, talking about the Scum Manifesto. And, as somebody who destroys so many books myself, right? Or I think about it as kind of like a composting process, but there is a level of destruction embedded in it. I've always wanted to ask you, like, how you have felt cutting into them and effectively, losing the book, so to speak. And I've often joked that like I could make more money as a rare bookseller than I could as an artist because some of the books that I cut into, I remember I cut into this Jeb book before I ever knew who Jeb was, and destroyed this like $900 book. And okay, I'm not very sentimental about it. I think of myself as almost like a kind of butcher, but I don't meet a lot of other people who feel that way. And I suppose I've always wanted to ask you, as we talk about sort of archive reamalgamation, like how that functions for you.
Well, thanks for that question, Carmen. I mean, I would never cut a book by Jeb. Shame on you. No, just
I didn't know. Don't tell her.
No. I just joking, but no, it was the first time they were like rare, precious books that I had built my visual vocabulary on. My hands were sweating. I just like the first one I cut was like a crappy like anthology that was like, and then I just got more and more brazen about the project and cut like more and more pricey rare edition books. And it was the most freeing thing that I have ever done because of this thing that I'm talking about. Like I live in a 250 square foot tenement apartment on the Lower East Side. Like if I have books on my shelf, that means that other books can't live here. Like I have to make choices about what's going to take up my psychic space. So it's, and I think that there's a really kind of interesting way that question, and maybe to tie in with what Izabella is saying about like kind of the closing comments about us here as collaborators, that it is about who we bring into the room. It is about how the five of us are talking. It is about like centering the margins, it is about like kind of thinking about that there's I don't know, maybe go ahead, Keisha, get it.
I mean, because I think I keep coming back to like the question of like whose voices get to be in the room with us. And then like what happens like once you're in the room. But I think also what you're saying, Justine, is also making me think about like recognizing how we are all in the room. And that's, and I think it's making me think about, these choices, but also like these ideas and practices around care. It's just making me think about all that.
Has anybody read, I'm sure you all have, Sarah Ahmed's book, Living a Feminist Life? In the introduction, she talks about, I might be misremembering this phrase, but the politics of citation, and how she only quotes and draws and cites from feminists of color. And, what you were saying, Justine, well, both of you, Justine and Keisha, is making me think about that and this broader conversation, of course, about how we animate the archive, what voices we pull into the room, or what Sarah Ahmed would describe as like, how we build our house or something, feels really meaningful here, that like there's only so much space on the shelf. And so like in dislodging, sort of literally and symbolically, like dislodging those other books makes space for something else. So that's really useful for me to hear. I've been wanting to ask you that question for years.
We could also get rid of the shelf, you know what I'm saying?
Yes.
Amen.
We don't need the shelf.
I think that's a pretty amazing place to end. Get rid of the shelf. Thank you so much, everybody, for your time and your insights. And I love to see how everyone spoke together and how rich the themes were. So thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Love the book.
Oh,
Yeah.
I had it next to me the
I
whole
love
conversation.
all of your books. I think they're wonderful. Thank
Bye, everyone.
you so much.
Take-
Bye.
Bye-bye.